There is a place in California where families go skiing every single winter. Kids build snowmen in the parking lot. Tourists snap pictures next to a bright blue sky and snowy peaks. Almost none of them know one simple fact. They are standing inside the mouth of one of the biggest volcanoes on the whole continent. This volcano did not blow up last year. It did not blow up last century either. It happened a very long time ago. But here is the part that should make you sit up a little straighter. The ground under that ski town has been moving, rising, settling, rising again, for the last 45 years, on and off, almost like it is breathing. Scientists have watched the middle of that valley push upward almost a whole foot in less than a year. They have found a gas with no smell and no color that can kill a patch of forest and knock a person out cold without any warning at all. And not long ago, they used sound waves to look deep under the ground and found something that made even the calmest geologists lean in a little closer to their screens. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why this quiet, pretty valley in California sits on the same watch list as some of the most dangerous volcanoes in the entire country. You are also going to understand why almost nobody outside of science actually knows this story. So let's go back to the beginning, because it is bigger, older, and stranger than most people realize. Section 1. The volcano nobody talks about. Ask any random person to name a volcano in California, and you will probably hear the same answer over and over. Mount Shasta. It is the tall, lonely, snow-covered mountain up near the Oregon border. It shows up on postcards. It shows up on calendars. It even shows up in paintings hanging in coffee shops. People love Mount Shasta because it looks exactly like what a volcano is supposed to look like. Tall, pointy, covered in snow, dramatic in the way a volcano should be. Some people will tell you something else. They will say, California does not really have volcanoes worth worrying about. They will say, California only has earthquakes. That is the disaster everyone talks about. It is in the movies. It is in the school safety drills. It is the thing people joke about when the ground shakes even a tiny bit under their feet. Both of those answers make sense. Both of them are also missing something huge. There is another volcano in California, and it is not a mountain at all. It is a valley. A wide, gentle-looking dip in the land that stretches for about 20 miles from end to end. If you did not know any better, you would think it was just a pretty place to camp, fish, or ski. Families drive right through the middle of it every single day without a second thought. It is called Long Valley, and it sits right next to Mammoth Lakes, one of the most popular ski towns in the entire state. It is close to June Lake, where people go for quiet weekend trips. It is close to Convict Lake, where people cast fishing lines into cold, clear water. None of those spots look dangerous. They look like the kind of place you would want to retire someday. Take a moment to think about what that valley actually looks like on a clear morning. Snow-capped peaks ring the outside like the walls of a giant bowl. Steam rises gently off a lake somewhere in the distance. A ski lift hums quietly as it carries people up toward the slopes. It is peaceful. It is beautiful. It is exactly the kind of view that ends up on a postcard sitting in a gift shop rack. Nothing about that view screams danger. And that might be the most important detail in this entire story, because the most closely watched volcano in the state does not look like a threat at all. It looks like a vacation. Here's the strange part. Even though it does not look scary at all, this is the volcano that scientists actually watch the closest. Not Mount Shasta, not some far-off mountain nobody visits. This quiet, sleepy-looking valley, the one with ski lifts and campgrounds and hiking trails running straight across the middle of it. Why would a valley get more attention from scientists than a tall, dramatic-looking mountain? Part of the answer is simple. A wide, flat-feeling valley just does not look dangerous from the side of a highway the way a snow-covered cone does. Nobody pulls over to take a dramatic photo of a gentle dip in the land. But looks can be very misleading, and the real answer goes back to something that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, something so big it is almost hard to picture in your head. That story is coming up next, and once you hear the scale of it, you will understand exactly why nobody in science ever stopped paying attention to this place. Before we get into that, though, I want to ask you something. If a place this well known, this well visited, could be hiding something this big without most people ever noticing, what else might be hiding in plain sight closer to where you live? That is exactly the kind of question this channel was built around. Every video here digs into real, true, slightly unsettling facts about ordinary-looking places, the kind of facts that make you look at the world a little differently once you know them. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because there's a lot more where this came from, and you will not want to miss what gets covered next. Section 2. The explosion that buried a world. To understand why Long Valley gets so much attention, you have to go back a very long time. About 760,000 years ago, long before any human being ever set foot in California, something happened underground that is almost too big to picture. A massive amount of melted rock had been building up beneath the surface for a very long time. The pressure kept growing and growing, the same way air keeps building up inside a balloon that somebody keeps blowing into without ever letting any air out. Eventually, all of that pressure had nowhere left to go. The ground exploded outward in one of the biggest blasts this part of the world has ever seen. This was not a small, gentle volcano with a little bit of lava dribbling down a hillside. This was one of the largest eruptions in the history of the continent. Ash and broken rock shot high into the sky and spread out across hundreds of miles in every direction. It fell like thick gray snow over rivers, forests, and open land, choking streams and blocking out the sun for days at a time. If an eruption on that scale happened today, it would bury entire states under a blanket of ash thick enough to bury a car, turning green farmland into gray, lifeless desert almost overnight. Try to picture the amount of material involved. Scientists estimate the eruption threw out enough ash and broken rock to fill up a space large enough to cover a huge portion of an entire state several feet deep, all at once, in a single event. It is the kind of number that stops making sense the longer you stare at it, which is exactly why it is so hard for most people to connect a quiet ski valley today with an explosion of that size so long ago. The land simply healed over time, grew trees, filled with lakes, and slowly turned into the peaceful-looking place people visit today. After the eruption, something even stranger happened underground. All that melted rock had been sitting below the surface like a giant hidden pool. Once so much of it blasted out into the sky, the empty space left behind could no longer hold up the weight of the ground above it. The land simply caved in on itself, the same way the middle of a cake sinks after too much batter gets scooped out from underneath before it finishes baking. That collapse is what created the wide, bowl-shaped valley we now call Long Valley. Every hiking trail, every ski slope, every parking lot sitting there today rests on the floor of what was once one of the most violent explosions this region has ever known. You might think a place like that would go completely calm after releasing that much pressure all at once. Surely all that built-up energy would just fade away quietly over hundreds of thousands of years, right? That is exactly what most people would assume, but this valley was not finished, not even close. In fact, a smaller eruption happened again nearby, close to Mammoth Lake, only around 300 years ago. That is not some distant, ancient event. That is recent enough that people already living in the area at the time may have actually watched it happen with their own eyes. So this valley never fully went quiet. It just got much harder to notice because the warning signs stopped looking like explosions and started looking like something far sneakier and far quieter instead. To understand exactly how sneaky, we need to jump ahead to a moment that changed everything, a moment that happened well within living memory, close enough that people alive today still remember it clearly. Section 3. The year the ground woke up. Let's jump ahead to the late 1970s. For almost 20 years before that, the area around Long Valley had stayed fairly calm and quiet. Then, in 1978, a sharp, sudden earthquake struck just outside the valley, breaking that long stretch of stillness. It was strong enough to rattle windows and grab people's attention, but nobody suspected what was coming just 2 years later. In the summer of 1980, the ground let loose in a way nobody expected. 4 powerful earthquakes, each one strong enough to badly shake buildings and knock things clean off shelves, struck one right after another within just a couple of days. People in the area barely had time to catch their breath after one quake before the next one hit. Homes shook. Nerves were completely frayed. And when everything finally settled down, scientists rushed in to figure out what could possibly cause such a sudden, violent burst of shaking in a place that had been so quiet for nearly 2 decades. What they found stunned them. The very center of the valley, the middle of that giant bowl-shaped dip in the land, had physically pushed upward. Not by some tiny, unnoticeable amount either. It had risen almost a full foot in less than a year. Think about that for a second. Think about the floor of your own house staying exactly the same for your whole life, and then one day you notice the middle of the room is now a foot higher than it used to be, with no construction crew, no work being done, nothing you can see causing it at all. That is roughly the scale of what scientists were staring at back in 1980. Solid ground, rising on its own, being pushed upward from somewhere far below the surface where nobody could see. That single discovery earned Long Valley a permanent spot on the government's official watch list. From that point forward, scientists began treating this quiet valley the same way a doctor treats a patient with an unusual heartbeat. Not panicking about it, but never fully looking away either. Here's the part that makes this even more interesting. That uplift in 1980 was not a one-time event that happened and then stopped for good. Later measurements showed the middle of the valley kept rising on and off for years and years afterward. Even now, decades later, it is still slowly climbing, just at a much slower pace than that dramatic first jump back in 1980. Somewhere in that valley right now there is a small metal marker driven straight into solid rock, and a scientist checking it every so often finds it has drifted just a little further since the last time anyone looked. The rising ground was not the only strange thing either. Every so often, without much warning, The whole area gets hit by what scientists call a swarm, which is really just a fancy word for a large batch of earthquakes arriving close together over a short period of time. In one stretch a few years back, hundreds of small quakes shook the area within a single day, some of them strong enough to be felt clearly inside homes in Mammoth Lakes, rattling dishes and waking people up in the middle of the night. And yet, here is the part that might surprise you. Most of the time, these swarms are not actually a sign that a big eruption is coming. Most of it is simply rock cracking and grinding under pressure, kind of like the creaks and pops an old wooden house makes when it settles on a cold night. It does not usually mean the house is falling apart. It just means something underneath is shifting under a lot of stress. Scientists can usually tell the difference between that kind of routine shaking and something more serious by studying the exact pattern of the waves the earthquake sends out, almost like reading a fingerprint left behind in the ground. That is exactly why this small patch of land in California became one of the most closely watched pieces of ground in the entire country. Machines are bolted straight into the bedrock, measuring tiny movements around the clock, day and night, without ever taking a break. Lasers bounce back and forth across the valley floor, measuring distances down to a fraction of a millimeter. Satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above quietly track whether the ground below has shifted even slightly since the week before. None of that expensive equipment sits there because scientists expect something huge to happen next week. It sits there because 45 years ago, this valley taught everyone a hard lesson. Sometimes the biggest warning signs do not arrive as one dramatic headline-grabbing moment. They creep in slowly, quietly, over years and years, and the only way to catch them early is to never stop watching, not even for a single day. There's something almost funny about how normal all of this has become for the people who live there. A geologist might spend her Tuesday morning walking out to check on a small metal marker sunk into the rock, note down a tiny shift smaller than the width of a coin, and then head home for dinner without telling anyone about it, because to her, this is just routine paperwork. Meanwhile, a few miles away, someone visiting from out of town is riding a chairlift up the mountain, completely unaware that the ground under the whole resort has been slowly climbing for nearly half a century. Two very different mornings happening in the exact same valley, at the exact same time. But rising ground and shaking earthquakes were not the only strange things happening in that valley. There was something else too, something you could not see, hear, or smell. And it turned out to be just as important as everything we have talked about so far. To understand it, we need to talk about a danger that hides in plain sight and gives absolutely no warning before it strikes. Section 4. The danger you cannot see or smell. Most people picture volcanic danger as something loud and obvious. Fire, smoke, bright orange lava creeping slowly down a hillside. If none of that is happening, it feels safe to assume nothing serious is going on underground at all. That assumption, though, can be dangerously wrong. Deep below Long Valley, heat and pressure left over from old volcanic activity are still pushing a certain gas upward through the soil, especially near a spot called Mammoth Mountain. This gas has no smell, it has no color. You could walk right through the middle of it and never notice a single thing was different, right up until it started causing real, serious problems. In high enough amounts, this gas pushes the normal breathable air right out of the ground, the same air that tree roots and small forest creatures depend on just to survive. Trees standing in these spots slowly die from the roots upward, even though nothing above ground looks wrong at first glance from a distance. Hikers walking through the area have come across entire patches of dead, brittle gray trees standing in the middle of otherwise healthy-looking forest, almost like a section of the woods simply gave up overnight, and nobody could tell why just from looking at it. Here is what makes this particular danger so unsettling. It gives you no warning at all. It is a little like walking across a frozen lake that looks completely solid the whole way across, when in truth, there is one small patch where the ice is dangerously thin, and you have absolutely no way of knowing which patch that is until you are already standing right on top of it. There is no smell to catch in the air ahead of time. There is no strange color or shimmer to spot before it becomes dangerous. A person could walk into a low, sheltered dip in the land and lose consciousness from a lack of oxygen before they even realized anything unusual was happening around them. Because of this, forest workers in the area now carry small handheld gas detectors as a normal, everyday part of their job, the exact same way a lifeguard carries a whistle at the beach. Not because trouble happens every single day, but because on the one day it does happen, you want your equipment to warn you before your own body ever does. Signs have even been put up for warning hikers to stay out of certain roped-off patches of forest, the same dead, gray sections we already talked about. It is a strange feeling to stand at the edge of one of those areas. The forest around it looks completely normal, full of green trees and birds calling out from the branches. Then you look ahead and see a patch of bare, brittle trunks standing perfectly still, almost like someone drew an invisible line in the dirt that only the trees seem to understand. Nothing about it looks explosive or dramatic. It just looks wrong in a quiet sort of way. And that quiet wrongness is exactly the kind of clue this valley keeps handing to anyone paying close enough attention. While that invisible danger was slowly being studied and mapped out, scientists were also chasing a much bigger question. What exactly is happening far underneath all of this? Is the old volcano actually cooling down for good and turning harmless, the way most people would naturally assume after hundreds of thousands of years? Or is something else entirely going on down there? To find out, researchers used a clever trick. They studied ordinary earthquakes that happen naturally in the area and carefully measured how fast the shaking waves from each one traveled through different layers of ground beneath the valley. Solid rock lets these waves travel one certain way. Melted rock slows them down and bends them in a very specific pattern that stands out clearly once you know what to look for. By comparing thousands of these tiny signals collected over years, scientists managed to build a rough picture of what the underground world beneath Long Valley actually looks like, all without ever digging a single hole into the ground. What they found changed the way many scientists thought about the entire situation. The leftover melted rock sitting beneath the valley has grown a hard, solid layer across the top of it, almost like a lid sealing it in. This lid formed slowly as the very top of that melted rock cooled down and hardened over a long stretch of time. At first, that might sound like reassuring news. A hardened lid sounds like something finally calming down for good, does it not? Not quite. Think about a candle that has been burning for a while and then gets blown out. The top layer of wax cools fast and turns hard and solid within just a few minutes. But if you dig a little spoon down through that hardened top layer, right near where the wick sits, you will usually still find soft, warm, half-melted wax sitting there underneath, completely unbothered by that hard shell forming on top. That is basically what scientists found underneath Long Valley. A solid crust has formed across the top, but the material sitting below that crust has not actually gone cold or still at all. It has simply been sealed underneath a brand new layer that changes the way heat and pressure now move through the whole system. That discovery is exactly why researchers did not relax after making it. Instead, they leaned in even closer, because it proved that whatever has been happening underground all this time has not actually finished happening yet. It just quietly changed shape a little, hiding itself a bit better than before. There are other small clues scattered around the valley too, if you know where to look. Hot springs bubble up in a few spots, warm enough to steam on a cold morning even when there is snow piled up all around them. Little vents in the ground release warm, faintly sulfur-smelling air in certain areas, the kind of thing a hiker might walk right past without a second thought, assuming it is just some strange quirk of nature rather than a small leftover clue pointing straight down toward the same hidden heat source scientists have been mapping for decades. By this point, you have already heard about ground that keeps rising on its own, earthquakes strong enough to shake an entire town within a single weekend, and an invisible gas that can silently kill trees and knock a person unconscious without a single warning sign. Put all three of those things together in your head for a second. Scientists eventually had to make one final official decision about exactly how seriously this valley should be taken compared to every other volcano in the country. That decision might be the single most important part of this entire story, and it is exactly where we are headed next. Section 5. The verdict. After decades of watching this valley rise, shake, and quietly leak invisible gas, the people in charge of tracking volcanoes across the entire United States had to make a call. They needed to officially rank Long Valley somewhere on a national list that measures how much attention and money each volcano truly deserves. The result surprised a lot of people outside of science. Long Valley earned a spot in the highest possible danger category the government uses, a category reserved for only a small handful of volcanoes across the whole country. It sits on that same short list alongside a few other famous, closely watched volcanoes that most people have actually heard of before. A quiet valley full of ski lifts and fishing spots, sitting right there next to some of the most talked about volcanoes in America. Now, before you start feeling nervous about your next ski trip, here's the part that really matters. Being placed on that high danger list does not mean an eruption is coming soon. Scientists are very clear about this. The actual chance of an eruption happening in any single year remains extremely low, roughly similar to the odds of a major earthquake striking directly along one of California's most famous fault lines in any given year. Nobody is telling people to stay away from Mammoth Lakes. Nobody is canceling ski season. So why rank it so high then, if the odds are genuinely that low? The answer has nothing to do with how likely an eruption is this year, and everything to do with what would happen if the odds ever did turn the wrong way, even decades from now. Think about everything that has been built up around that valley since the last major eruption thousands of years ago. Roads, hotels, ski resorts, an entire town full of homes, schools, and families. A place that used to be nearly empty wilderness is now a busy tourist destination visited by hundreds of thousands of people every single year. If something ever did happen there, The impact on people and property would be enormous, simply because so many more people now live and vacation directly on top of it compared to hundreds of thousands of years ago. Only a small handful of volcanoes anywhere in the country share this same top-tier ranking, and most of them are exactly the kind of names you would expect. Big, famous, dramatic-looking mountains that already show up in documentaries and history books. Long Valley sits quietly on that same list, without the dramatic mountain shape, without the fame, and without most visitors ever realizing they are looking straight at something that officially belongs in that same serious category. That ranking is really the reason every single thing we talked about earlier gets tracked so carefully, day after day, year after year. It is why the ground markers keep getting checked. It is why the gas detectors stay clipped to forest rangers' belts. It is why lasers keep bouncing quietly across the valley floor every single night, while skiers sleep soundly in their hotel rooms just a few miles away, completely unaware any of it is even happening. Here's the real shape of everything you just learned. It is not 5 separate unrelated mysteries scattered across random decades. It is one long, connected story running underneath a single valley the whole time. Ground that has slowly risen for 45 years without ever fully stopping. Earthquakes that arrive suddenly, rattle an entire town, and then fade away quietly, only to return again sometime later. Gas quietly escaping through soil in spots where no flame or smoke ever shows up above ground. Old melted rock that cooled just enough to grow a hard shell on top, while everything underneath that shell stays just as active as it ever was. And a national safety ranking that has never once been lowered because the underlying reasons behind it have never actually changed. This is not a scary story about a disaster waiting to happen tomorrow. It is a story about how the biggest, most important discoveries in science rarely arrive as one giant headline. Instead, they build up slowly, one small measurement at a time, one quiet season after another, until enough of those small pieces finally stack up into something worth talking about out loud. Think back to that ski town for a second, the one we started this whole video with. Every winter, thousands of people ride up that mountain laughing, taking photos, completely unaware of any of this. That is not because anyone is hiding anything from them. It is simply because the story never gets told in one place the way we just told it here. The government reports sit buried on websites nobody visits. The scientific papers get written for other scientists, full of complicated words most people would skip right past. The local news mentions a small earthquake swarm for one single day and then moves on to the next story. Piece by piece, the full picture never quite comes together for most people, even though every single piece of it has been sitting out in the open the entire time, free for anyone curious enough to go looking. So the next time somebody tells you California only has earthquakes to worry about, you will know the fuller story hiding underneath that quiet, pretty valley full of ski lifts and fishing spots. If this video taught you something you had no idea about before today, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you catch the next one the moment it goes live. There are a lot more strange, true stories like this one waiting to be told. Before you go, I want to know something. Have you ever driven through, hiked around, or even gone skiing near a place like this without having any clue what was sitting right underneath your feet the entire time? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and I would love to hear where you have been.